So, hi, my name is Henry Warwick. I'm an assistant professor at Ryerson University in Toronto. I teach communication theory, digital media, electronic music, fun stuff like that. You might think that I'm a great proponent of high technology, given that I make a living from the fruits of digital technology, but in actuality I'm very critical of such technology. At the same time, I'm not any kind of a Luddite by any stretch, but I'm also not a techno-utopianist. From my perspective, digital technology has its uses and purposes in contemporary industrial society. That this society is wholly unsustainable does not mean that it is not partially sustainable. In other words, some parts are more deserving of disappearance than others, and some parts are more likely to disappear more quickly than others as society transitions away from carbon-based fuels. The reason for this asymmetry are manifold and complex, and don't necessarily reflect well on human intentions or capabilities. Yet, they are nonetheless very real. My talk today is going to stray a bit from my original intention, for as I began writing the ideas for this conference, I realized that I'd already given much of my intended talk several years ago at the first conference, which Aaron described. And I don't like to really repeat myself year after year after year, so today I'm going to discuss something a little bit more controversial and a little bit closer to home, and I feel actually something more useful to this conference, as it is a conference on leadership and ideas. I would like to discuss the rhetoric of the peak oil movement and the global warming awareness movement as well, which is tied directly to the ecology movement in general. A big question implicit in the notion of this conference is one of futurity. What constitutes a future? Okay. We could simply say, whatever succeeds the present, and be done with it, but I don't think that really suffices, nor does it really do any justice to the subject. And what lies below all of this are some deeper philosophical notions, questions of what is nature in terms of the future, and the constant tug of technological determinism that underlies so much future-based discussion. Even further, the problem of determinism itself problematizes much of the debate surrounding futurity. Indeed, for the idea that the future, indeed, for example, the idea that the future is local. Note the use of the future in the perfect tense. The future is local. This is an assumption of absolute truth. The idea of a future that is necessarily total, the idea of a future that is necessarily totally local flies in the face of historical fact. People have been trading things across great distances for many thousands of years, at all levels of technological competence and technicity. I think it is fair to say that the future will not be local. It will be more local. So with a more nuanced and less binary vision of localization, a variety of possibilities and opportunities opens up, especially insofar as different levels of technology can be interfaced into these different implementations of localization. Futurity becomes less of a story told now of a now yet to be, and more of a broad sense of reasoned and modulated responses to a constantly changing environment and material circumstance. Part and parcel of localization as a strategic solution is the idea that there can be some reconciliation of nature to a balance. This may seem heretical at this gathering, however, from this new perspective, there really are no solutions. There is no balance. There is simply mitigation and management. Instead of trying to restore nature to balance, we can see that nature is really an invention of a culture that was never really balanced to begin with. And culture is just part of the natural cycle of the thermodynamic process we call life, where it inserts itself in the gradient of thermodynamics in order to reproduce more examples of itself in order to take advantage of that gradient. It's a universal process. From there, nature is then extracted from ecology. By removing nature from ecology, we leave green ecology behind and enter a phase of dark ecology, What follows that is subject to the dialectics of history, i.e. TBD, to be determined. With the abandonment of nature, we can repudiate the deadening cynicism and the smugness of the beautiful soul, who yearns for this mythical magic balance of nature, and the inherent consumerism that underlies the implementation of this beautiful soul in the context of contemporary industrialism. The problems with green ecology are many. I would like to presently focus on a rhetorical critique of green ecology as provided by the works of Timothy Morton, a professor of ecology and literature at UC Davis, and the author of the books Ecology Without Nature and The Ecological Moment. 5 minutes? I'm down to 5 minutes. That was 12 minutes?
Oh, you're right. Go, sorry. Go.
Okay. Because I'm only on page 2. Anyway, so, however, such a sober assessment of the human project as part of the ecological process permits us to see things quite beyond what was previously available to us when we labored under the notion of nature as somehow natural, or even more paralyzing, the notion that humanity and culture are somehow not part of the ecological process itself and exist as a negative in a continuum defined by the nature-culture divide. How technology figures in this will become clear later in my talk, but anyone clever enough or anyone versed in this, it should be fairly obvious already. First, dark ecology. The notion was laid out by Morton in his book, and it critiques the idea of the beautiful soul as a romantic ecological subject who, by separating themselves from the unbeautiful soul of the dark satanic mills of industrialism, lives in a removed space of smugness and cynicism, to quote Hegel in terms of this, quiescence and feebleness, which does not like to act or to touch anything for fear of surrendering its inward harmony, the source of morbid saintliness and yearning. And in the context of the ecological movement, this beautiful soul yearns for a world of harmony and balance, a nowhere utopia of goodwill, clean air, clean water, and wholesome food. Note, there is nothing wrong with yearning for such things. These are all commendable and good desires. However, it is the ideology of the beautiful soul that prevents such things from occurring. And it is a mindset that is endemic to the ecological movement, sadly based on a number of false premises. The first false premise is that nature is harmonious and balanced when left to its own methods. This, of course, implies that there is something outside nature that is not harmonious or balanced, and that is in the ideology of the beautiful soul, it is the cultural, the human, which exists at the other end of this continuum. Once we remove the continuum and expose it for the false dichotomy that it is, then the beautiful soul has no ground or motive for its carping or pretense. Furthermore, we get to see the ecology movement more clearly as a realm that is chaotic and subject to the wild swings and shifts, sometimes over very short periods of time. The ecology has no strategic vision. The universe has no memory. Research in paleontology has revealed a number of catastrophic movements in history, some of them not that long ago. For example, according to Dorian Behar and Sarahon Rossid, the two scientists, 70,000 years ago, humanity very nearly went extinct. Our numbers were reduced to approximately 2,000 people, all living on the east coast of South Africa. This is due to dramatic and rapid shifts in the ecology and climate. Now, out of that 2,000 people, we now have 7 billion. So, once we remove nature from ecology, we see very simply and clearly that there is no solution to our present dilemma. Just because there are no solutions doesn't mean catastrophe or even disaster. This is a critical distinction that is not obvious, and the rhetoric and philosophy surrounding this needs to be unpacked and examined. So let's take a look at a couple of the titles that I saw out front. I'm not criticizing the books, okay? These are important books that need to be read and dealt with, okay? So that's not the point. What I'm talking about is the rhetoric that they surround themselves with. Okay, man-made death. I'd like to add some background to help frame this debate. One is a quote from Man-Made Death by Edith Wissegrad. It's called The Authenticity Paradigm. It has to deal with, it's a discussion of Heidegger's theory of authenticity. The authenticity paradigm. Before mass death cast its shadow over contemporary existence, the most significant meaning structure which governed individual dying and attained consensus in Western culture is the assumption that a good death, even if not free of pain, is the measure of a good life. If we face our own eventual non-existence, if not affirmatively, at least without fear, that our lives have been moral failures, we've come to terms with the last things. And this coming to terms is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for assuring ourselves that our exit is free from the worry which casts a blemish not only on our final hours, but on all of life itself. fear of pain, anxiety of the loss of self, and terror before the unknown. Life can be lived with integrity only if death is already accepted as inseparable from it. Death is the wound life bears within itself. To know and accept this frees us from the pursuit of rational contemplation, integration into the cosmic whole, or more intense participation in the here and now, depending on the pattern that organizes experience. Okay, and then another quote would be by Marjorie Green from Authenticity and Existential Virtue. For Heidegger, genuine existence is existence which dares to face death, rising from the dissipating and deceptive consolation of today's concern to the inner realization that its own past must take shape and significance in relation to its inevitable tomorrow, last tomorrow. Contrasted with such genuine existence is Verfallen, the distinction or scattering of one's freedom in the cares of the everyday, where not the true individual, but das Man, the indifferent they, becomes sovereign. So, essentially, our traditional notions of authenticity and an authentic life are bound to our mortality. Thus, invoking mortality lends our rhetoric weight and value. When one uses a term like survival, it can only be used with the weight of its other, which is always imminent and contingent, and in the case of survival, death. Hence, a text that invokes survival is lending itself integrity and the power of a term that references death, the inevitable contingency, that unavoidable existential discontinuity of non-existence. It also brings about a power directive. This book requires your attention as it draws its authenticity, not from an appeal to your aesthetics and judgment, not from an appeal to your quantitative analysis skill sets, nor even your sensitivity to other human concerns such as compassion, caring for others, doing right by your fellow humans. No, it's founding its authority by way of a special appeal to your own self-interest through fear and terror, regarding the ineluctable loss of your own personal existence. Such an appeal is neither necessary nor useful to those who are concerned for the biosphere, and the proof is res ipsa loquitur. The facts simply speak for themselves. Peak oil and climate change activists may be armed with all the facts they want and all the data they can gather. But when they cloak their message in language that invokes the philosophy of a Nazi like Heidegger and shamelessly trade on fear, then they are using the same brutalism that the system they seek to end employs. So in order to lead others, there needs to be a change in the fundamental tenor of the literature, away from one of doom and catastrophe to rhetorics that enhance agency and community. To do this, there needs to be a fundamental shift in the underlying philosophies that inform the rhetoric, an abandonment of the internal psychic fascism of Heideggerian existentialism that holds one's authentic moral ground hostage to one's own notion of death, and an abandonment of notions of mechanistic determinism and the notion of the inevitable. Much of the conversation here has been steeped in this rhetoric, and I submit that it is not the peak oil or climate change message that has failed, but the rhetoric used to express it. And under this rhetoric, fundamental philosophical notions that need to be dispensed with, such as the idea of the beautiful soul, the balance of nature, and similar misconceptions. So we may go on to a more creative and open-ended, empowering, and plausible future. The end. Who has questions? Go ahead.
As far as getting better rhetoric, is there any examples that they have, or do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, a counterexample would be the Permaculture manual by Mollison. It's called Permaculture, a design manual. It's inviting, it's permaculture, so it has a kind of mystery of what the term is, and then a design manual. Not the, a design manual. And design is obviously a creative process, and manual is constructive. It's like I'm reading a manual on how to do something. So that's a classic example. Just the keying of that rhetoric on the title page brings you into a totally different space than saying, plant your crops this way or die. You know, you see what I mean? And so it has a complete, so by being inviting, it's the difference between, say, I don't know, 20th century classical music and jazz. You know, you get something that was composed in the bombed out wrecks of Dresden, and it's all going to be dissonant, scary music because it's exclusionary music. But then you get jazz, which is all invitational. It's like, come on in, listen to the jazz, like that, you see? It's, the rhetoric matters. Yes?
Henry, I agree with you that the future will be more local, but I would like to hear you expand on in what ways you think the future will be more local.
Well, I think the future and futurity are interesting questions on themselves, but I think there's time, because there's always time scales involved. So I think that as energy becomes more expensive and resources become more expensive, those things which drop out first will be the things that will become more localized more quickly. And also just for the sake of quality. So the kinds of fruit that I might get imported to Toronto in the middle of February from Chile, that might get really expensive. You know, so there may be other substitutions that are more local. See what I mean? That could happen like next year. So, but then you talk about further, longer term things, then you're going to have much more localized production of industrial goods, simply because it'll make more sense and it'll be less expensive. There'll be a market reason to do that. Yeah.
One last question.
Sure, go ahead.
I would like to invite you to expand a little bit on the determinism. Let me set the context for that. I often, in my work, hear people using language which basically puts cause in like oil, like people did all this stuff because the oil was there, and you know,
Right.
the price is such and such, so people will respond in certain
Yeah,
ways.
yeah, that's
So-
it's called technological determinism. It was a concept that is not, it's historical. It was invented by Veblen, a sociologist, and I think he came up with the term in 1902 or 1898, I forget. And the idea is that technology determines social and basically social factors. So it's not that society determines technology, it's that technology determines society.
Yeah.
An example would be the cell phone. Okay, the cell phone has completely changed the way people communicate. Communication is a basic social function, but the introduction of the cell phone has completely changed it. You see, so there's that. Now there's the flip side, which is called social determinism, which is that society determines technology. And the argument for that would be the Greeks had steam engines and they had railroad cars that took crap out of the mines, but they never invented the railroad, because if they did, then they wouldn't need slaves. And the slave was the essential economic unit, so you can't get rid of the slave. You see, so that's a social reason for not having a technology. See, so those are kind of like the two ends of the argument. So the question that I find more interesting is the notion of determinism itself. Why is there a necessary link between one thing and another? And I think that that's a very deeply problematic discussion that probably we could go on for hours. But yeah, but I agree. So determinism itself is the problematic notion. I think that in our universe we see correlations between things, and therefore we assume causation, and that's not a reasonable or logical thing. Cool.